Hi, so this is the role of organic chemistry in the COVID pandemic. So first up, we have lisinopril, which is a hypertension medication. So as you can see, the functional groups are the organic acid, amine, ketone, and amide in red, orange, blue, and purple, respectively. So the chemical formula of it is C21H31 N3O5. And it is the anhydrous form of the long-acting angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitor lisinopril with anti-hypertensive activity. It has been used in the treatment of hypertension and congestive heart failure. Further properties are melting point, 148 degrees Celsius, color white, molecular weight, 405.5, and the solubility is greater or equal to 10 milligrams per milliliter. So Lispro, which is an insulin, it has the chemical formula C257H389 N65 O77S6. So insulin Lispro is a recombinant therapeutic agent which is chemically identical to or similar to endogenous human insulin. It is used for the treatment of hyperglycemia caused by type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Some of the other chemical properties are that the molecular weight is 5,814. So, organic reactions, lisinopril, and it is an angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitor used to treat hypertension. It does this by relaxing blood vessels by inhibiting them. This causes decreased reabsorption in the kidneys and a possible side effect of serious hypotension or low blood pressure. So, organic reactions Lispro. So, peptide synthesis is one. And then the most effective method for the preparation of the 51 residue ester-linked polypeptide chain of ester insulin was the use of unprotected peptide thioester segments prepared from peptide hydrazide synthesized by FMOC chemistry, SPPS, and condensed by native chemical ligation. So insulin Lispro binds to the insulin receptor, IR, a heterotetrameric protein consisting of 2 extracellular alpha units and 2 transmembrane beta units. The binding of insulin to the alpha subunit of the IR stimulates the tyrosine kinase activity intrinsic to the beta unit, the beta subunit of the receptor.
And now, let's actually take a look on some statistics on diabetes and hypertension, which we're going to use to examine inequities between whites and people of color. As you can see in the chart, white people are significantly less likely to be diagnosed with diabetes compared to people of color. For example, American Indians have a 14.7% chance of being diagnosed with diabetes compared to white people's 7.5% chance of being diagnosed with diabetes. Also, but the level of education that people have gained also plays a factor in the chance of being diagnosed with diabetes. For example, people who have a degree greater than a high school one has a 7.5% chance of being diagnosed with diabetes compared to those with less than a high school degree having a 13.3% chance of being diagnosed with diabetes. Hypertension also follows similar trends. For example, non-Hispanic white people had a much lower chance of getting hypertension compared to people of color. For example, black people. And then we can use these trends but to see possible resultant disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on black, Hispanic, and indigenous communities. As you can see on the left, but despite only making up less than 20% of the population, Hispanic and Latino made up for 28.8% of all COVID-19 cases and deaths. However, but even though whites made up 60% of the U.S. population, but they only made up 50.2% of the COVID-19 cases and deaths. But transitioning to the right side, we can see that blacks and Hispanics are significantly more likely to gain cases, hospitalizations, and die due to COVID-19 compared to white people. But now let's actually look at the cost of raw production of medications versus the cost of the actual medication. For example, insulin, for which it costs around 30 cents to make, usually sells for about $300, which is a really high markup.
Economic disparities contributing to inequities in healthcare and insurance access in relation to persons of color. Economic disparities contributing to inequities in insurance access in relation to persons of color. This figure shows unemployment rates by race and Hispanic or Latino ethnicity. Looking at the dark blue and light blue lines, we see that Black and Hispanic people are more likely to be unemployed as compared to white and Asian people. Employment is an important factor to insurance access, as many receive workers' compensation insurance from their jobs and others use paychecks to afford insurance fees. Coverage is an important issue in the United States. In 2018, a study found that 24 million people are uninsured and nearly 48 million people are underinsured. Looking at statistics that break down those that are uninsured, we see that Hispanic or Latino people are far more likely to be uninsured than white or Asian people. Hispanic or Latino people make up nearly 40% of those with no health insurance coverage, as compared to Black people who make up around 24%, Asian people who make up around 20%, and white people who make up around 12%. The issue doesn't just stop at uninsured people. Those that are underinsured also face gaps in access. Many times, those in poverty use Medicaid as their primary form of health insurance. However, this chart, physicians accepting payments for new patients by coverage type, shows that many physicians choose not to accept Medicaid patients. This is due to lengthy paperwork, administrative burdens, and reimbursement fees. This leads to many people without access to healthcare, which manifests later on in chronic health conditions because they are not given treatment early.
So these are some of the connections that our group found between economic disparities and increased instances of COVID-19 related to systemic inequities, along with recommendations drawn from various studies. So prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, people of color have faced long-standing disparities in the healthcare system. With poor quality of care, people of color experience increased instances of COVID-19 related systemic inequities. Research shows that American Indian and Alaska Native, Black, and Hispanic people have experienced disproportionate rates of illness and death due to COVID-19. The higher rates of illness and death among people of color reflect increased risk of exposure to the virus due to living, working, and transportation situations, increased risk of experience serious illness if affected due to higher rates of underlying health conditions, and increased barriers to testing and treatment due to existing disparities in access to healthcare. Not only are people of color susceptible to higher rates of illness and deaths, the pandemic has taken a disproportionate toll on the financial security and mental health and well-being of people of color, low-income people, LGBT people, and other minority groups. Research across states shows a consistent pattern of Black and Hispanic people receiving smaller shares of vaccinations compared to their proportion of cases, deaths, resulting in lower vaccination rates. These disparities in vaccinations reflect the long-standing inequities that create increased barriers to healthcare for people of color and other minority groups. Moreover, they leave people of color at increased risk for infection and illness and hinder efforts to achieve population-level immunity.
Closing statements. Relationship between recommendations pertaining to issues and how they will solve economic disparities. Listed here are 3 recommendations for solving economic disparities. First is generics. Generics are a lot more affordable than brand name drugs, making them more accessible to the general public. Second, expanding the Affordable Care Act. At the start of Biden's term as president, he has asked for $200 million to expand the Affordable Care Act, creating greater access to healthcare to all Americans, regardless of economic status. Third are proposals for Medicare for All. The most popular proposal is made by Senator Bernie Sanders. This promises the same healthcare plan for all Americans, eliminating discrimination based on insurance. This eliminates the prioritization of more expensive insurance plans. Next, depth of explanation as to how knowledge of chemistry informs the importance of each medication's impacts on lowering not only diabetes and hypertension, but of also COVID-19. So, knowledge of chemistry first helps in the development of medications. Almost all medications are developed with knowledge of chemistry. Knowledge of chemistry also informs people as to how medications work. For diabetes medication, it controls the reaction and regulation of glucose and insulin in the human body. For hypertension medication, it controls the blocking of the tightening of blood vessels in the heart to prevent hypertension. Through knowledge of chemistry and its effects, we know that with medicine controlling diabetes and hypertension, this can help a person's prospects towards COVID-19 because a healthier person is not going to be as affected by COVID-19 as a person with immunodeficiencies, and COVID-19 is not going to cause the same lasting impacts to an elderly person as it is to a healthy 20-something-year-old that also exercises. Chemistry is necessary for this knowledge. Knowing chemistry is going to help doctors cure long-term COVID-19 patients.